Good evening and welcome. My name is Megan Lovett, and I serve the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry as Director of Continuing Education. Thanks to each of you for joining us tonight for our 5th Continuing Education webinar of the fall semester. As part of the school's mission, we offer an array of enrichment opportunities to foster Christian faith and promote lifelong learning. We do this by offering presentations such as this one, as well as online courses, videos, podcasts, and other resources for personal enrichment and professional development. Our fall online courses are underway. Our next cohort of courses start November 25th and include A People of Hope and Mary, the Mother of Jesus. We are currently accepting enrollments in both of these courses. If you're interested in learning more about our online courses or would like to enroll in a Crossroads course, we will include a registration link in the chat. Thanks to our speaker for granting us permission to record today's webinar. Tomorrow, you will receive a follow-up email with details about accessing the recording when it is ready. At the end of the presentation, there'll be an opportunity for question and answer. Please feel free to enter a question into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen at any time during the presentation. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. Finally, we are also able to offer live closed captioning for today's webinar. Please click on the closed captioning button on the bottom of your screen to enable the feature. Many thanks to Dot and Carolyn, graduate students here at the STM, for providing the closed captioning for us today. Now for today's presentation. In 1991, the first Pyne lecture was held at Weston Jesuit School of Theology, the generous gift of Professor Margaret Pyne, and it continued here at the School of Theology and Ministry beginning in 2009. A lifelong advocate for persons with disabilities, Margaret Pyne served as Associate Dean of Special Education at Lesley College. She saw the need to educate theological students about ministry for and with persons with disabilities, and she felt so strongly about this that she donated this lecture series. We owe Professor Pyne a debt of gratitude for her vision and foresight. Her gift ensures that this topic is front and center on a regular basis in our programming for graduate students and for the public. We have two special guests in our Zoom audience tonight, Ann Barry Goodfellow and Ruth Ann Rasbold. Ann is the trustee of the Pyne Endowment Trust, and both she and Ruth Ann were personal friends of Margaret Pyne. Thanks to you both for your continued support and participation. We are delighted that you could join us tonight via Zoom. I now invite Father Tom Stegman, Dean of the School of Theology and Ministry, to introduce our speaker.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation, Spiritual and Religious Development in Neurodivergent Children and Adolescents. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Jessica Black is an educational neuroscientist and associate professor at the Boston College School of Social Work. Dr. Black obtained her doctorate from the Stanford University School of Education and then completed a postdoctoral research fellowship in cognitive neuroscience at the Center for Interdisciplinary Brain Sciences Research within the Stanford University School of Medicine. Dr. Black's research integrates the use of neuroimaging, such as functional and structural MRI, standard neuropsychological behavioral testing, and environmental measures, such as home supports to predict outcomes in children and adolescents identified as neurodivergent, that is, diagnosed with a neurodevelopmental disability. Keenly interested in childhood resilience, Dr. Black has extended her neuroimaging research to understand better the neural underpinnings of resilience during pivotal transitions in the lives of youth. Dr. Black has developed numerous courses for Boston College undergraduate and graduate students at the intersection of religion, neuroscience, and social work. She's an unwavering advocate for understanding and supporting neurodiversity throughout the course of life. We are honored to have such a wonderful scholar and colleague, and I can attest Dr. Black's a great colleague and a wonderful friend of the STM. We're honored to have such a wonderful colleague join us here tonight. So welcome, Dr. Black.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for those very kind words. I greatly appreciate them. And we will begin today's talk by being able to first take a moment I thought would be helpful and actually center ourselves. Just paying attention, and you're not missing any sound. There is no sound. Maybe another 10 seconds. I'll tell you what I really appreciate about this video. So you can see the landscape. You can see up close the individual raindrops. The raindrops then continuing to the ground and actually becoming part of the lake. So in this, we see both the individual and the community gathering together. This will be an important component of the talk today. All right. Just going to move on. Able to share the next component with you. Hopefully that was centering for you. As we move forward, I always find it helpful to have a sense of where we're going to be going together. So I'll begin with our primary topic of the night. I'll have some definitions. And before we really get into the research and implications for practice, I thought it would be helpful to have some voices. So the voices will be my own and also that of other parents and individuals who have particular experiences with this topic. We'll move on to research, and the research is broad, so we won't be able to cover all of it, but I'll give you some highlights. And then finally, we'll move into practice. What does this mean for church, for religious education? Where do we go from here? I ask you to think about the first word that came to mind when you saw this image. Now, I haven't had dinner yet, so I'm a little bit hungry, but the first word didn't come up as hunger. Instead, it came up for me as unexpected. And yet beautiful. And then I thought to myself, if I were to think about children and the work that I do, what would come to mind? What does this actually capture for me? And for me, it captures this youth with so many possibilities, so much to be able to hold, to carry, and to share in such colorful ways. And that will be the essence of the talk tonight as we move forward to discuss and really uncover what is actually known about spiritual and religious experiences and beliefs of neurodivergent children. And we'll get into what that means soon. So neurodivergent children and adolescents, their families, and we'll also talk about community as well, so that we're able to advance research. And I'll talk a little bit about my research in this area, practice and policy, to be increasingly inclusive and responsive to their faith-based needs and desires. And plus, I just love this image. I think it's a fabulous one. Let's begin with definitions. And again, each of these definitions that you're seeing here have multiple definitions that I could have drawn from sub-definitions as well. So I just thought it would be helpful as I move through the talk for us to have some semblance of what I'm referring to. The first is neurodivergent. Means having a brain that functions in ways that diverge from the dominant societal standards or expectations. Realize it's a very broad term. And when we think about something like dominant societal standards or expectations, I'd like to give the example of developmental dyslexia. So this is considered a specific learning disorder. It's where individuals, both children and adults, have a challenging time being able to recognize phonemes, to be able to read fluently, sometimes with comprehension, memory, and spelling. However, this wouldn't have been considered any type of disorder, disability, or anything to diagnose for most of human history, because the reality is that the majority of individuals who have ever lived and died on this earth never read. Reading is modern, it's new, and so therefore there is an expectation and a standard that's been built over time, but it wasn't necessarily what our brain was meant for. If we move forward to think about neurotheology, which may be a discipline that you've heard of, it's budding, I will say, and it has mixed viewpoints, but it seeks to understand the relationship between the brain and theology, and between the mind and religion. From Andrew Newberg, who actually studies neurotheology, it takes an integrated approach to understand human nature by combining physical and spiritual. We'll also talk about how it's challenging to feel like we don't fit in, like we're on the social periphery. A stress is a threat, a challenge, or a change to the body's internal balance, to homeostasis. And short term, it's okay. But when it goes on long term, it can actually be quite weathering to our body's biology and psychology. JEDI. JEDI refers to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we'll be referencing this at various points in the talk today, in particular as we're discussing inclusion and the importance of recognizing all children and adolescents in services. Universal design and learning. This is really a set of design principles. It's meant to guide educators. And educators here I see not only standing up with chalk in a classroom, looking at first graders, but really anyone who in any way is inspiring learning in others. What happens in this space is it really is supposed to reduce barriers when it comes to learning for students. This is done through improving motivation, presenting information in a variety of ways, which is referred to as multimodality that we'll get to next, and expanding how students can express their understanding, all very important when it comes to faith formation and education for neurodivergent youth. And finally, multimodality. I referred to this earlier, but essentially it means teaching concepts using multiple modes. Modes are channels of information or anything that communicates meaning in some way. So throughout this talk, I'm going to be as multimodal as I possibly can, using pictures and illustrations, audio, also through various writing and print. At the end, we have some music. And finally, being able to actually think through the ways in which multimodality is related to education and learning when it comes to faith. As I mentioned, neurodiversity, neurodiverse, neurodivergent have many different definitions. And so if you look at the definition here for neurodivergent, it's described as having a less typical cognitive variation, such as autism or ADHD. We then can move out to think about neurodiversity, which is the diversity of variation of cognitive functioning in humans. As a neuroscientist, I'm reminded all of the time and try to remind others that no two brains are alike, even in identical twins. So The importance of neurodiversity then points to what is neurodiverse, but essentially the inclusion of a number of substantial cognitive functioning variations. So this is in no way saying, well, there's one group versus another group, but in fact, we have diversity when it comes to cognitive functioning, when it comes to emotional functioning and social functioning as well. So if we look at what neurodivergence is then, the presence or grouping of less typical cognitive variations, but less typical can also be beautiful. It doesn't, in this space, actually refer to anything that is lesser, but just less typical. I can think of lots of things in the world that are less typical, but have incredible value and need to be included in society. So as you can see below, dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, ADHD, there are a number of other domains that are diagnosable when it comes to what is neurodivergent. When you receive the link to this PowerPoint, you'll also be able to click on any of the links and it'll take you to a deeper discussion. In terms of voices, I'll read through these. And again, just to highlight the importance of thinking about the voices before we delve right into the research. This is from a parent who had an experience where the children's ministry director asked if she could see my spouse and I after the service, and I felt a knot form in the pit of my stomach. I knew what was coming. Sure enough, she explained that this congregation wouldn't be able to provide us any care for our son, who is nonverbal and on the autism spectrum. There are various titles that have shown up in newspapers with subjective experience of parents who say things like kids with disabilities face many challenges. Church shouldn't be one of them. And then as parents describe and discuss, our periodic disengagement from organized religion is not unique. If we were going to attend this church, my son would be unable to join the other kids in children's church. My spouse or I would have to sit apart from the rest of the congregation in a family room with him. As I feared, our search for a community of faith would have to start over again. The next week, we just stayed home. And then here we have a quote from a parent who not only identifies as having a disability, but also has a child with ADHD, and has found that this parent needs to become an advocate for her son on so many fronts. Religious education and involvement are no different. So as she has found, it is up to the people with ADHD, the people who love them, to educate and advocate for people with ADHD in religious life. All right, this is especially true when it comes to the context of enabling children to have full access. This focuses on ADHD, but many other voices focus on autism or dyslexia as well. I thought it important to also bring up voices from ministry as well. We won't watch this video, it's about 5 minutes long, but essentially Father Snyder describes how after 1 year of a 3-year assignment as a school chaplain and youth ministry leader, he was shocked when he was asked to move. And as it turned out, he was told that it just didn't seem to be a good fit for him. And what seemed initially frustrating actually took him back. It became a moment as a blessing because eventually he was diagnosed with autism, a diagnosis that he describes as helping him better understand himself and ultimately actually find roles in ministries that were better suited for him. Now, this also comes from an overview of dyslexia rather than autism. Over the years, it's been our privilege to know a number of religious leaders who shared with us that they were dyslexic. There are a wide range of dyslexic mind strengths. This comes from the Dyslexia Advantage focus that come into play for ministry, among them empathy, big picture thinking, interconnected reasoning, narrative reasoning, and dynamic reasoning. And again, this isn't just necessarily from ministry, but also focuses on youth, both children and adolescents who have dyslexia. So a quote from ministry, who was also diagnosed with dyslexia. I see things and then describe them. And so structural organizational thinking, forward strategic thinking, having a sense of where things are and addressing needs appropriately, all these things come easily. When it comes to the Bible, I see patterns and connections in Scripture. The quote continues with the way that this individual actually decides to design sermons. First, to read the context of the passage, and then to be able to use flow diagrams, lots of color, developing a structure, creating a mind map, converting the mind map into a full text, and then producing a final version that actually is in color and works well for this individual. So the voices here matter deeply to me. A lot of the work that tends to be done when it comes to neuroscience, when it comes to neurodivergence, tends to be quantitative. We look at numbers, we compare groups, but we don't necessarily listen to the voices. And if we do, we may at times ask particular questions that are considered qualitative. And yet, when we go to try to describe to others how the qualitative responses matter, we need to code those too. We need to essentially break down qualitative into quantitative, which is really challenging to do when you think about a number of these different quotes. Which leads me into discussing the research. And in order to talk through research, it's important to really recognize the theory, the models, the frameworks that are most relevant when we're thinking about young people and their spiritual and religious development. First, we can take stages of development if we're looking at Fowler's 6 stages of faith development, starting at 0, moving to 6, with various individuals staying at different stages for periods of time. This has also been connected to Piaget's focus on cognitive development in children. So it's important to realize that as children and adolescents are developing their faith and forming their identities, their beliefs, their connections, their brains are also developing at that particular time. The brain is highly sensitive from 0 to 3, again in adolescence, and in between is very, very malleable. So what we think about these early times, the first stage is the rise of imagination. And during this time, it's particularly important to be hands-on, to have opportunities to explore hands-on. And in fact, this touches greatly on neurodivergence because children who have been diagnosed with ADHD or autism do well when they're able to access materials in multiple ways, not just verbally or to focus highly on the importance of reading and writing, but especially at this stage between 0 and 2, exploring, and not just exploring one day a week, but throughout the week as well. If we look at stage 2, which is really thinking about toddlerhood, moving into early childhood, and then finally moving into the elementary age, if we think about the age of 6 or 7, is meaning making. The way that we make meaning, again, is not just linguistic. When we're thinking about connections to faith, we want to think about the whole body. And how does the whole body experience faith, belief, religion, and spirituality? If we then move on to think about the next stage, stage 3, is all about forming an identity. And during this time, which is really from early adolescence and quite frankly through adulthood, when we're forming our own identity and multiple identities and the intersection of identities, We're able to do so certainly by talking about it, but also by experiencing it, by thinking about it, how it connects throughout our week, throughout our months, throughout our years as well. And not just thinking about it, but doing things, action-oriented, things that are connected directly to behaviors and outcomes. During stage 4 is reflective faith. And if you look at reflective faith, which again is around the time of young adulthood, this is still a time when our brains are developing deeply, where we're growing connections among various regions. And what we're doing is myelinating. We're actually able to create more efficient neural networks in the brain that allow us to be able to make even deeper meaning, forming identity, okay, and then thinking through faith. So as we think about children who are neurodivergent, we want to think as well about what is happening in terms of various stages of development, whether it's cognitive, social, or emotional, because what we know about this term is that it's broad. And that if you get to know one individual, for example, with autism or dyslexia, you know that one individual. It's very challenging to take a broad strokes approach to how every single stage in some way is connected to every single individual, especially when it comes to neurodivergence, because it could be the case that when we're thinking about the rise of imagination or meaning making, that the channels through which children and adolescents have to be able to grow those areas are limited. And we want to be able to be expansive in our thinking about how to access faith. How do we access religion? If we move forward to then think about various models, okay, so moving from stages to various models, which really takes us from the individual experience into a more community experience. There are various models of disability from religious tradition. So we'll think about the various research to practice models. There have been theologians who use disability models, and they often reflect on how it seems to be that the Christian model tends to those who align with medical models of disability. And there are two different models that we can think of when it comes to disability. The first model is the medical model, and essentially it refers to the problem is the person with the disability or the disabled individual. And so it thinks about things like maybe they can't do this, they can't do that, all right? Whereas the social model of disability actually focuses on the systems and says we need to actually touch on wider systems to be able to access faith, to be able to access a religious community, to be able to develop one's own stages of faith. So we can think about, for example, access to buildings. How well are they actually designed when we're thinking about children, for example, who can become very easily overstimulated with multi-sensory happening in many ways, with crowds of individuals, with people coming right up to them and trying to welcome, but can also create a fear response or a stress response as well. So we want to be able to think about the physical structures in our social world, because the physical structures essentially allow access to the social structures, to the social support, all right? So rather than isolation, rather than special schools, let's think about models of inclusion and ways in which both physical spaces can limit our social interaction and social spaces, but also how we can directly affect those social spaces as well. And we'll spend a bit of time talking about that today. Another model to be able to think about is the importance of a child within systems. So before you saw the stage theory, and then you saw this theory that's connected to, do we see disability as a medical model, which is really deficit driven, or do we see it more as a social model that's focused on systems? Well, here we have a child within those systems. And it seems to be, from culling a lot of the literature, that children are still, and families who no longer feel part of a religious community do experience and practice faith at home. However, it's the connection that they also have to macro systems, to wider cultural values, social values, connection to God. But there's spaces in between, I believe, we can develop, we can continue to work on. For example, if we think more specifically about what this model is, we can think about how children are actually connected most closely to their microsystem, which includes church, the mesosystem, which really includes connections among the various microsystems. To what extent throughout the week are parents, family members, siblings, the child themselves connected to church, so that what you see is a bridging among not just one day a week, but throughout the experience that they have during the week. There are also connections as well to wider systems, and finally to change over time. In fact, there's been a lot of change over time when it comes to disability theory, when it comes to how we diagnose, but still remains stigma related to neurodevelopmental divergence, when it comes to mental health as well. So we want to be able to then get back into that individual and think about, what is it going to take for them to be able to actually have their needs met when we're thinking back to this model of an individual within systems? And what we need to focus on for these children and adolescents is, of course, first, basic needs. But some of those needs, such as safety needs, security and safety, are also, if you move to up a little bit, psychological in nature. So am I in a space in this particular environment where I feel safe, I feel welcome, I feel like I belong? Or do I feel like I'm on the social periphery, or my family is on the social periphery, which, quite frankly, biologically is a dangerous place to be. When we feel lonely and disconnected, it actually increases our level of cortisol, our stress hormone. And when it increases our stress hormone, it actually does some pretty damaging things over time to the rest of our body and our brain. For example, it'll interrupt sleep. And when we don't sleep well, it interrupts our learning, cognition, and emotion. And finally, when we think about areas of purpose, of mission, of being able to actually fulfill needs, it's being able to fulfill one's increased potential, including creative activities. So we want to be able to think, when it comes to religious education, for example, what are those activities? How are children able to access them? We also want to think about multiple intelligences. We tend to focus primarily on linguistic intelligence and also numeracy, mathematical intelligence, and yet there's so many other ways to be able to access faith. When we think about religion and spirituality, we focus sometimes on reading or on listening. But what about music? How can that be used throughout childhood and adolescence? And again, not just one day, but throughout the week, so that it becomes integrated into children's lives. How can they connect to their bodies, to religion as well? So what is it going to take? And often it's being able to move our bodies, to be able to move them however we can. And when we're asked to sit quietly and sit still, it's really challenging for young children to do that. In fact, it creates a stress response. And when we're in a stress state, it's really challenging to access our other strengths, let alone some of our challenges. There are interpersonal skills that could be of value, of strength. Who in this church is able to connect, to volunteer, to reach out to these families? And in what ways are we able to welcome? We can think about, how do we actually create words that are inclusive? How do we create those messages? And then what will they look like? How are we able to connect children and adolescents to nature, to the world? And how do we help them build interpersonal skills as well? So all of these basically suggest that within individuals, we have a number of intelligences. And as we think about ways to access religion and develop our faith, it's important thinking about children and adolescents. How many ways are they able to access to be able to learn and grow? Or are they in a space of stress where one of these intelligence is highlighted? This is considered the one way to be able to connect. Well, in fact, we know that the more we're able to grow and connect in multiple ways, the more we're going to learn. We also want to make sure that as we're working through research, it's neuroscience informed. And when we think about neuroscience informed, we want to make sure that we recognize that it is our brain's role to be able to adapt, to be able to use it or lose it, and to be particularly sensitive to its environment. So we want to think about what messaging we have and realize, in fact, that when it comes to research, all of these different areas of neurodivergence tend to overlap with one another. So again, it's a very broad term, it's a very diverse population, and it's important to realize that as you're increasing access, for example, for a child with autism, who also may be diagnosed with dyslexia, that you're helping many of their parts of self to be able to engage. It's been found that when it comes to religion and disability, that there is significant variation in religious service attendance rates for children with chronic health conditions. Now, chronic health conditions include physical impairment, they include various diagnoses that include neurodivergence, but are not solely related to neurodivergence. So in 3 waves of a nationally representative sample of children in the United States, this researcher, Dr. Whitehead, actually was able to investigate variation in attendance rates across a range of conditions. Children with chronic health conditions are more likely to never attend religious worship services. Specifically, children with chronic health conditions that impede communication and social interaction are most likely to never attend. So when we think about, despite shifts in prevalence, these findings seem to be stable over time. So there are significant implications for researchers and religious communities alike. From this particular study, it was identified that children with chronic health conditions are 14% more likely to never attend worship services. And in fact, it is identified that, according to previous research, 1 in 3 parents of children with disabilities have switched to a new place of worship because they didn't feel included. So Dr. Whitehead then suggests it's really important to have a system in place where families are seen and heard, because there isn't one cookie cutter approach to welcoming. However, it is important to welcome, and there are a number of myths out there as well about autism. Some of likely to not be deep in religious faith. And yet, if you look at this particular study of 477 individuals, 81 of them diagnosed on the autism spectrum disorder, what you see here is those who have been diagnosed with autism actually have significant amount of religious faith. They strongly agree. And in fact, the amount of whether they disagree or not is really low compared to those who are not autistic, where the neither agree nor disagree is actually significantly higher. So again, it's important to be showing up, and once you show up, to be seen. Dr. Whitehead says, I would like to think that this research could serve as a wake-up call to religious communities in our nation. In many ways, this population is unseen because they never show up, or when they do, they have a negative experience, a negative return, and never return. Now, again, this is a study, and there are many studies like this, but it's also important to recognize that every church is different and that some really do have practice and policies in place that are very supportive of a diverse array of children, adolescents, parents, and ways to be able to access faith. So one way to be able to do that is actually to talk about the practice related to talking to children about disability. It's important to recognize that these discussions need to happen. It's also important to think about particular times in which awareness can increase. So for example, in this particular church, there is an emphasis on respect for persons with disabilities. Importance of including them equally in the life of the church is crucial for our understanding of the human person. We also know it's important to be able to boost engagement when we're thinking about religious education. And there are ways to do that. Be able to think about engagement, connection, and support. And each of these areas have been identified. For example, when it comes to engagement, there are ways to be able to connect with the Bible, to be able to connect with religion by experiencing it, not just necessarily seeing images, but actually being able to make them yourself. So in this case, what we see here is the road to Emmaus, and it's actually in Lego form. It was created with stop motion. And it was then, after created in stop motion, there was audio added to it, and it is a live link that you're able to watch. But again, being able to really think about all the intelligences that were used to be able to build that. There are also ways to be able to think about the importance of connection as protection, and a number of resources here that will essentially help children and adolescents with diverse learning needs to be able to connect on a personal level as well. There are questions too when it comes to early adulthood or young adulthood, sometimes referred, in terms of the number of individuals who stop attending church. And if you actually look at this period of time and what the suggestions are, it seems to be the case that a number of them, if I were to break these down into different domains, I would see the first four as really connected to connection. Do I belong? Is there a place for me here? Work responsibilities, I may see separate from that, but I can also see that there may be ways in which we can still access religion and our faith with various schedules as well. We think about the importance of support as well. Learning is not a place, it's a relationship between teacher and students. So we want to be able to really think about how we actually build those relationships. One way to do that is through universal design. So in this image here, you see the question, could you please shovel the ramp? And the individual responds, all these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you. But the point is well made. But if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in. And that's the idea of universal design for learning. And so you can ask questions when it comes to religious education related to, do I actually offer, do we have modes of being able to access learning and faith that are universal in their design and approach? For example, when you think about accessibility, there are a number of individuals who are diagnosed with ADHD, with dyslexia, sometimes autism and dyslexia, who have a challenging time with phonemes, being able to read, being able to know how to pronounce something. And so there actually is online the ability to be able to access any word from the Bible to be able to hear how it actually is pronounced. Again, multiple ways using multimodality to be able to access learning experiences. And to be able to recognize that there are a number of ways that we can do that. And one of the ways to be able to do it really, really effectively so that it stays is to be able to create, not just to hear, not just to sit and listen, but to create for ourselves. And so if we think about the learning pyramid, and it's funny here as I'm giving this lecture, where in fact, what we think about average retention rates, a lecture or reading comprises 15% of the retention. But if you're actually able to use multimodality, if you're actually able to continue to think about various strengths and multiple intelligences, what you'll see is the importance of audiovisual or demonstration, discussion, the practice of actually doing, and finally of teaching others is so much more effective when it comes to retention. This is a curriculum that I actually created related to multiple intelligences for a school that I do a lot of curriculum development. And this was for a school with children who had learning differences, primarily dyslexia and sometimes dyslexia and autism as well. And so I wanted to be able to think through what are the different domains and the different fields we want to be able to see as indicators of learning and of thinking. And within those, how do we actually recognize whether the indicators show particular behaviors as well? So if assessment is an important part of this, there are ways to assess as well. I did the same when it came to thinking about various gifts and multiple intelligences, and way to actually include that in curriculum, from storytelling to graphing to theater to songs. As we close, I wanted to be able to mention a few resources as well. Again, all available through links. If you're interested in more development-related resources, they can be found here. And if you're interested in more neuroscience-related resources, they can be found here. I would like to also say thank you very much to the School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College and the School of Social Work for support for this talk, and the Pyne Endowment Trust in memory of Professor Pyne, who again was a lifelong advocate for persons with disabilities. I would also like to share inspiration for this talk. To my daughter and my son, who have very different brains, very different ways of experiencing the world, and yet each of them as unique as they are beautiful. So thank you to my family, as always, in support of the work that I do. If you need another space of calm, you're able to access it here at Planet Home. And finally, we'll move to the question and answer period.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blackwood. Well-organized and informative presentation. We're very, very appreciative for your time this evening. I just included a link in the chat. Also, Dr. Black has graciously offered to continue the conversation, so we'll get to as many questions as we can before our time ends at 7, but she's also offered to have smaller Zoom gatherings for those that are interested, so please check out the link in the chat as well. So the first question posted in the Q&A is timely, and now that we're in a time of pandemic, do you have any suggestions on how do you engage families, during this time where it might not be safe for them to come to Mass or to come to church services?
Mm-hmm. So whether it is, and I think it's a really important question, and I think it's also one that there may be ways to always access Mass. For example, when we think about the pandemic as a potential to be able to reach out, so that if one does need to be remote physically, one is not remote socially and in connection to faith and connection to God as well. So I think that one way to be able to think about it is that maybe this is a way to be able to continue to reach out to families. The second is to really think about ways in which there are sort of pocket spaces throughout the week that if you're not able to attend Mass, you're still able to practice faith, to be able to connect to God. And so this may mean sort of micro spaces on various days for children and families. to be able to engage with all of the intelligences, to be able to send out particular activities that one can do on their own, and also to be able to listen in as well during Mass.
Thank you. Another question, what are some suggestions for inviting parents into conversation with church staff or volunteers about the various ways to leverage the strengths of neurodivergent kids and make faith formation accessible in a way that's welcoming? So engaging families in the discussion.
So it is a fabulous question, and it is very timely because I am currently submitting a grant to be able to actually interrogate this question, because as it stands right now, the literature says, well, it's important to welcome, and it's important to make sure that you don't welcome in the same way, because you want to be, of course, really deeply aware of what the needs are of each child, adolescent, and family member as well. And so the research that I'm going to be suggesting is to first ask questions related to families' experience within church settings. Also, to be able to look at faith leaders' experience of what is neurodiversity, what is neurodevelopmental disability, what does this mean to you? And finally, to look at the convergence between what parents are experiencing and what churches are actually saying about the experience. So the first thing we want to be able to understand is really what are parents' experiences at a quantitative level, not just at a qualitative level. And so I would suggest really just offering everyone to be able to contribute in various ways. And sometimes what that means when you're inviting parents into conversations with church staff is to be able to think about, well, if they're parents and they have children and they're worried about, particular behaviors or, will my child be accepted, to really make sure that it's a welcoming space itself, so that when you're actually engaged in these conversations, you're not feeling in a space of stress, but actually open to be able to discuss. I think another component that's really important is to be able to take what I see as a strengths assessment. And I think it's important for us to do this, not just for children, but for adults as well. I mean, how are we contributing to church? What are we bringing with us? What are those gifts that really can be recognized as well? So I think that that is an important component to consider as well, is really a mapping of strengths and a recognition of how, once we know what those strengths are, they really can be leveraged, so that once I'm in a space where I feel like I am being noticed and acknowledged, and my strengths and the way that I learn are of value, and I see that other people are similar to me, I'll feel even more connected in that space. So I would say to try to make it transparent.
Thank you. We've had a couple of questions about religious ed, about Catholic schools, and I think the overall challenge that they're running into are resources, lack of training, lack of information, plans, education plans not designed for religious ed. If you could just speak a little bit about in a traditional classroom setting, a religious classroom setting, I think would cover a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm. So if we're thinking about, for example, Catholic schools, if we're thinking about ways in which, these are not necessarily designed for that space. This is actually a discussion that Megan and I had a year ago, I think it was, where we were talking about what can we do? How can we serve schools to be able to sort of reach out and get this information out and really think about practical steps and training that's needed, and how do we make it more accessible? And so I actually really welcome the conversation. There'll be a link soon to be able to continue this conversation. And for all of those of you who are in schools, invested in schools, and would like to be able to build something like this collaboratively through research and funding, importantly, and also through practice, I welcome it.
Thank you so much. There have been a couple questions just looking for resources. I know that you have included several in your presentation. I don't know if you have others that you want to point for ministers, for DREs, Or is the PowerPoint the best place to go?
So there's one here. This is a book, and I can create all these links, Megan, so that everyone has access to them. But this is one book, and it's really an important book about parents' experience who have children with chronic health needs, diagnosed with various conditions or disabilities. Another area that I think is really essential to be able to consider is to be able to think about various education websites that also help us to understand how the brain learns. And so one of really interesting reads is this one as well. So again, sort of neuroscience and religion being able to come together. I'll post these to you, Megan, and you can disseminate them, but I think there are a number of books, there are a number of websites beyond the ones that are on here. I just didn't want to overwhelm with slides. So the answer is yes, there are. And I'm also happy to have anyone reach me directly through email. So if there are very specific things you're looking for, please let me know and I'll do my very best to find it, or have some of my research assistants, I have 20 research assistants in the lab working on these areas, be able to find it for you.
Thank you so much. As I'm sure our audience has noticed, Dr. Black is so generous in her time, in her resource, in the giving of herself and her knowledge. We did include a link in the chat. It will also be in the follow-up email tomorrow that you'll receive. She is open and willing to have these continued conversations through Zoom. So if you are interested, please do fill it out, and we'll continue the conversation in the months ahead. Unfortunately, we are running low on time, and so if you do have a question, please save it for that time. I echo some of the other comments in the Q&A. Thank you so much, Dr. Black, for your presentation today, and thank you to our audience for joining us as well. As we said, we'll share the links and emails to come. We do have 2 more webinars for those that are interested. There's actually one this evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It is in Spanish. It's called El Encuentro de Dios en la Frontera, or Encountering God on the Border. Please check out the link to our additional webinars. It's also posted in the chat if you have time this evening to join that one. And we have our final webinar of the semester on Thursday, November 12th, Stand Together, a conversation about Jesuit refugee services in the Middle East and North Africa. It's going to feature our Dean, Tom Stegman, and Father Daniel Coreau, both of the Society of Jesus. Father Coreau is the Regional Director for Jesuit Refugee Service in the Middle East and North Africa. The follow-up email that we'll send will also include a link to that webinar as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Black, and thank you to our audience for joining us this evening. Have a good night.